Beneath the cobbled streets of 18th century Paris, long before sunrise lit the rooftops or chimneys began to whisper smoke into the air, the day had already begun for the city's bakers. It wasn't the kind of beginning marked by breakfast or conversation. It was silent, mechanical, and blackened by soot. For the master baker and his journeymen, their work often started not at dawn, but at 2 in the morning, sometimes earlier. And for those hours, the rest of the world simply didn't exist. The bakehouse was not the rustic, fragrant place romanticized in modern imagination. It was a confined, dim room tucked behind the storefront or in the cellar, where walls remained damp even in summer, and where the only warmth came from the gaping mouth of the oven. The floor was often uneven stone, slick with the remnants of old flour and water. At the center of the room stood the enormous wood-fired oven, its belly always hungry for more fuel. Bundles of wood that had to be chopped, hauled, and fed into it long before the first batch of dough was ready to rise. Bakers lived inside a rhythm unlike anyone else. By the time most of the city was settling into slumber, they were already kneading dough with sore hands. It was not merely physical exhaustion they endured. Regulations imposed by the police of bread, yes, that was an actual post in the Parisian bureaucracy, meant that every loaf had to meet strict standards. Weight, shape, even the cost per pound was regulated, often leading to accusations, fines, and bitter rivalries. Inspectors arrived without notice, checking for short loaves or underweight boules, and the penalties could be steep. A fine meant lost income. Repeated infractions could lead to the loss of a license. One could lose everything for shaving a gram too many off a loaf. The dough itself was another burden. Flour had to be ordered in advance, and not all flour was equal. Some was coarse and milled in haste, filled with husks or even sawdust. Yes, sawdust, added by dishonest millers to bulk up their sacks. The baker had no choice but to sift what he could, discard what was unusable, and carry on. Water had to be drawn from a communal well or delivered in barrels, and it was rarely clean. Fermentation relied on sourdough starters or brewer's yeast if one was lucky, both finicky in the best of times and infuriating in the cold, damp stillness of early morning. As the first loaves began to form, long rows of shaped dough would rest beneath linen cloths on rough-hewn tables. There was little time to watch them rise. The oven had to be perfectly managed. Too hot, and the crust would blacken. Too cool, and the bread would remain pale and raw inside. A seasoned baker learned to read the heat with his skin, holding out his arm to feel the radiant warmth, trusting instinct over tools. Timing was everything. One batch in, the next already forming, sweat clinging to the back of the neck, soot streaking the forearms, all while the city slept overhead in oblivious comfort. Journeymen, apprentices who lived in the baker's household, were rarely paid in coin. They were often compensated in meals, shelter, and a promise of skills that might one day lead to independence. But until then, they were laborers first and students second. They swept, lifted, carried, and chopped. They fetched water, sifted flour, tended the fire,
and bore the scolding of their master with bowed heads. And even when the work was done, it wasn't truly done. The bakehouse had to be cleaned meticulously. The bread had to be arranged in the front shop, ready for the earliest customers, often domestic servants who queued at the door before daylight to buy the day's first loaves for their employers' tables.
The smell of fresh bread did waft into the air, but the bakers rarely noticed. Their noses were numb to it. Their clothes were stiff with flour. Their fingers often cracked or burned. They had no time to enjoy what they made and rarely tasted it. Their sustenance was crusts and offcuts, misshapen pieces or leftover scraps. Real loaves were for customers, sold under surveillance and strict price control, watched by the community and the state alike. Any indulgence or theft from one's own stock could lead to accusations of cheating the public trust. As the sun crept up over Paris, casting long golden shadows down the alleys, the bakers were often just finishing. They would collapse into a few short hours of sleep, if they were lucky, before the next round of preparation began. Their families adjusted to their odd rhythm. Children learned to keep quiet during the day. Wives managed the front of the shop or dealt with accounts. The house of a baker did not sleep like other homes. It existed in a quiet hum of preparation, exhaustion, and regulated precision. The rhythm of baking was unrelenting, and holidays offered no relief. In fact, holy days meant more demand. Festive loaves, special shapes, or spiced buns required extra time and effort. Yet the prices were fixed, even when ingredients weren't. Bakers often worked at a loss, driven not by profit, but by duty and fear. Bread, after all, was the cornerstone of the Parisian diet. When prices rose or quality dropped, riots followed. A baker could find himself the target of angry mobs, accused of hoarding or cheating, even when he was just barely surviving himself. And so the work continued, day after day, night after night, beneath the city's surface. Few thanked the baker. Fewer still understood the toll. But the bread was always there, waiting in the shops, on the tables, in the baskets of the poor and the rich alike, made in silence, in soot, and in sacrifice. The heart of a Parisian bakery was not the storefront or the crusty golden loaves lined neatly on display. It was the oven, large, stone-lined, and always hungry. Before a single customer had stirred from their bed, before the city's first carriage rattled along cobblestone, the oven had already been alive for hours. Its appetite defined the rhythm of a baker's life, and it was rarely forgiving. In the 18th century, ovens weren't simply tools, they were obligations. Most bakers didn't own their own ovens outright. Instead, they rented or were granted rights to use one of the communal ovens regulated by the city's guilds. These public bakehouses, or fours banaux, came with conditions, fees, strict rules, and inspections. A baker's relationship with the oven was tightly bound to a hierarchy of oversight, punishment, and precision. Lighting the oven began in the dead of night, often before midnight. The fire needed time to burn down into coals that would heat the stone walls evenly. The process took hours, and it wasn't simply a matter of throwing in some wood. The fire had to be managed carefully. Too hot, and the bread would burn on the outside while remaining raw within. Too cool, and the loaves would sag and collapse. Achieving the perfect radiant heat was a skill learned over years and punished with fines if done poorly. Wood was expensive, and regulations tightly governed how much could be burned. City officials, tasked with controlling smoke and soot emissions, made routine visits. A bakery that produced too much ash or sent up thick plumes into the street could be reprimanded. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A baker could be fined for failing to produce bread on time, and also for producing too much heat in doing so.
As dawn approached, the oven doors were opened and the loaves placed inside with long wooden paddles. Bakers moved swiftly and silently, a choreography honed by repetition. The workspace was dim, the only illumination often coming from the red glow of the oven itself. Blackened walls, scorched floor tiles, and the permanent scent of burnt flour created a kind of sensory enclosure, a world apart from the sleeping city just outside. The heat was constant, pressing against the skin and drying the mouth. Bakers often worked shirtless, not for comfort, but because any fabric too close to the body became soaked with sweat and stiff with ash. The temperature near the oven could climb high enough to cause fainting, and cases of heat exhaustion were common, especially in summer. Yet there was no slowing down. The bread had to be finished before market mornings opened. Then there were the fines. The city enforced a detailed code of conduct for bakers. Loaves had to meet certain weights. Undersized bread was considered theft from the public, and the penalties were steep. A city inspector could, and often did, weigh loaves on site. If found too light, the entire batch could be confiscated. Repeated offenses could lead to public shaming or loss of license. A baker's scale, like his oven, was subject to inspection and distrust. Adding to the pressure were the price controls. In a time when bread was considered a public necessity, bakers could not set their own prices. The price of bread was fixed by municipal decree, updated frequently to reflect grain costs, and failure to comply wasn't just a business risk, it was a legal one. In some periods of grain shortage, bakers were forced to sell at a loss. Some went bankrupt. Others diluted their dough with less desirable ingredients, bean flour, bran, or even chalk, to stretch their supply, hoping not to get caught. But even these desperate measures were met with oversight. Inspectors sometimes arrived unannounced, breaking open a loaf and examining its crumb for signs of adulteration. If something unusual was discovered, punishment followed. Fines, again, or worse, temporary closures that left families without income and neighborhoods without bread.
And despite all these risks and regulations, bakers remained. Not for the money, which was inconsistent at best, and not for status, which was minimal. It was simply what they did. The bakery was often a family endeavor, passed down through generations. Children learned the trade early, sweeping ash, kneading dough, or fetching water. Wives rose before dawn to help shape rolls or tend to customers once the doors opened. By sunrise, the first customers would arrive, servants, porters, laborers grabbing a hot roll before heading to the markets or the river. The shop itself would begin to stir with the sound of coin and chatter. But for the bakers, this was the end of their long shift. They were blackened with soot, slick with sweat, and nearly invisible. Their work was done before most of the city even opened its eyes. There was little time for rest. The midday break was short, and the process would start again by evening, preparing ingredients, setting aside flour, checking on orders for the next day. Sundays were not always days of rest. If anything, demand increased on holidays or feast days when expectations were higher and the stakes sharper. This rhythm, so relentless and unacknowledged, shaped not just the bakers, but the city itself. Bread was the cornerstone of urban survival. And yet, few paused to consider the hands that had labored in the dark to bring it to their table. The soot-streaked walls, the heat-split hands, the silent weighing of dough before dawn, these were not stories told in public squares or preserved in grand paintings. But they happened every night for generations. Long before the sun cast its first pale light across the Parisian rooftops, the day's financial risks had already begun for the city's bakers. It might seem strange to picture a trade built on something as wholesome as bread, burdened with bureaucratic threats and economic danger. But in 18th century France, bakers operated under a constant weight of fines, quotas, and suspicion. The work was not only exhausting, it was perilous in the quiet, punishing way that rarely made headlines but always shaped lives. In many ways, the baker's day began not with dough, but with regulation. Every loaf produced had to meet strict guild standards: weight, consistency, shape, and every deviation could be interpreted as fraud. Undersized loaves, even, by a few ounces, could be seized, not merely discarded, but publicly destroyed to set an example. A baker's pride could be undone by a single misjudged measure. This wasn't theoretical, it was routine. City inspectors, sometimes accompanied by guild officials, walked into bakeries unannounced, scale in hand. Loaves were lifted, sliced, weighed. In rare cases, they were even boiled to assess internal density. An underweight loaf meant more than a slap on the wrist. Fines were issued, licenses were questioned, and word of poor performance circulated quickly. Too many violations, and a baker could lose his right to practice. A catastrophe, not only for him, but for his entire family. Because the bakery was often the center of a household economy, it wasn't unusual for several generations to live above or behind the shop. Elderly parents, siblings, children, apprentices. Each relied on the income from bread sales, which were, by design, never meant to be lucrative. Bread was controlled by price caps, and in times of scarcity, those caps became harsher. The public needed affordable bread. The government feared unrest. The baker became the pressure point between supply, demand, and political stability. And so, during grain shortages, which were not uncommon, bakers were sometimes forced to sell at prices below their actual production costs. Imagine working 10, 12, 14 hours a day only to end in the red. And yet, not baking was not an option either. Too few loaves on the shelves, and accusations of hoarding or rebellion could follow. Some bakers were attacked by mobs. Others simply closed their shops and disappeared. Families adapted. Corners were cut, often reluctantly. Some bakers began to incorporate cheaper ingredients to stretch the dough: bran, bean flour, or even powdered bone or chalk in extreme cases. These additions were usually tasteless and not dangerous, but they were forbidden nonetheless. If discovered by an inspector, and many were trained to detect even subtle signs of adulteration, the punishment could be severe. Yet not all inspectors were consistent. Some were lenient, understanding the impossible conditions under which bakers operated. Others were rigid or used their role to extract bribes. A few arrived after receiving tips from rival bakers, eager to thin the competition. Thus, trust between guild members was fragile. A sense of quiet rivalry always simmered beneath the surface. Within the family, this pressure translated into quiet desperation. Wives took on more roles, balancing customer service with ingredient preparation. Children were not merely observers. By the age of 7 or 8, many helped mix, measure, and even operate small tasks near the oven, a practice dangerous enough to leave lasting scars. Education, if it existed at all, was secondary. The shop came first. Disputes were common. Tired tempers flared in the early hours. Arguments over portion sizes, pricing decisions, or even the order of delivery could create rifts between husbands and wives, fathers and sons. These were not dramatic fights, but they carved lines into faces, strained shoulders, and sent boys out the back door early, looking for a different path, one that didn't reek of yeast and regret. There were other risks, too. Fire was always present. Ovens that ran for 12 to 15 hours a day were dangerous. A single spark, especially in the cramped wooden quarters of older Paris neighborhoods, could ignite tragedy. Some bakers installed makeshift sandboxes near their ovens, primitive fire suppression systems. A few kept barrels of brine nearby. Insurance did not exist in a formal sense. If the shop burned, it was gone. On top of this were the fines not related to baking itself, but to the running of the business. A door left open too long could be deemed a disruption to the street. Noise in the early hours could trigger a complaint. Refuse improperly discarded drew attention. Many bakers were fined not for their bread, but for the life that swirled around it. A horse tethered too close, a delivery made too loudly, a chimney that smoked beyond a certain limit. And yet, people stayed in the trade. Why? Because they were born into it. Because the bakery was not just a livelihood, but a place of identity. Names were tied to loaves, generations remembered for crust, texture, and consistency. There was honor in mastering fermentation, in pulling a perfect boule from the oven before sunrise. It wasn't glory, but it was respect. In the right circles, in the narrow streets where everyone knew everyone, a baker's name mattered. Still, the costs were many. Illness from exhaustion, family breakdown, financial collapse. Few became wealthy. Most made enough to survive, and even that was not guaranteed. Bread might have been a necessity to the city, but bakers were never treated as such. They were the silent machinery behind daily life, expected to function without complaint, without rest, and without failure. As you step back from this world, imagine the toll it took on body and mind. The soft creak of the shop door, the flowered apron hung by the wall, the scales wiped down at the end of the day, each one a small ritual of control in a life otherwise dominated by regulation and risk. In the stillness before evening preparations began, a baker might sit at the back of the shop and rest their eyes for just a moment. That was all there was time for. And then the next day began again. The life of a Parisian baker in the 18th century was not just shaped by flour and fire, but by oversight. Careful, constant, and often stifling. Bakers operated under a dense canopy of guild regulations, municipal decrees, and customary expectations. They were watched, weighed, and frequently reminded of their role in the city's fragile social fabric. While their labor fed the population, their freedom to conduct business was tightly restricted by those in power. At the heart of this oversight were the baking guilds, structured associations that did more than simply organize the profession. These guilds controlled access to the trade, often requiring long apprenticeships and expensive fees. Entry into the guild was not guaranteed, and many bakers labored for years under a master without ever gaining full membership. Those who did attain guild status were both privileged and bound, allowed to operate their own bakery, but also required to adhere strictly to the guild's rules on production, pricing, and conduct. The guilds didn't just regulate bread itself. They regulated the baker, where he could set up shop, how many ovens he could use, how many apprentices he could hire. All were defined in minute detail. In theory, these measures were designed to protect the public from unfair pricing or poor quality. In practice, they created a hierarchy where established bakers protected their dominance and newcomers struggled for a foothold. Innovation was discouraged. Efficiency, if it disrupted the old ways, was suspect. The city, too, played its role in regulation. The Parisian police were not merely enforcers of criminal law. They were deeply involved in food inspection and marketplace oversight. Bakers could be summoned, questioned, or fined at any time. City officials might test bread quality, examine weights and measures, or audit ingredient stocks. A shortfall in flour during a shortage could provoke suspicion, even accusations of hoarding or sabotage. The fear of punishment hung in the background of every working day. For example, if a baker sold bread that was even slightly underweight, he could face confiscation of his product, heavy fines, or worse, public exposure. Being publicly posted as a violator of the bread laws damaged more than pride. It could mean a loss of customer trust or even riots, especially during times of scarcity. Bread was too central, too symbolic to allow mistakes. During periods of famine or poor harvests, tensions only increased. The government's desire to control food prices, particularly the price of bread, meant bakers bore the brunt of popular frustration.
When grain was scarce and bread prices rose, bakers were often scapegoated. Accusations of greed or dishonesty became common. Some were harassed or assaulted. A baker's shop might be vandalized or mobbed if locals believed he was overcharging, even when he was simply trying to break even under shifting mandates. To insulate themselves from public fury, some bakers tried to adhere not just to the letter of the law, but to its spirit. They might give away day-old bread, offer small credits to regulars, or bake smaller rolls to allow poor customers to buy something, anything. But such gestures were risky. Giving away bread too often could spark rumors of hidden reserves, and producing alternate forms of bread, such as biscuits or sweet rolls, was only permitted within strict limits, often requiring separate licenses or special permissions. Beyond legal structures, there were cultural expectations. Bakers occupied a strange place in the social order, neither wealthy nor poor, essential yet invisible. Their labor was respected in theory, but rarely rewarded in practice. They lived among the working classes, but did not share quite the same rhythms. Their hours were nocturnal, their tools dangerous, their product essential, but they were not artisans in the celebrated sense, nor traders who could adjust prices with supply and demand. Within this rigid system, the daily routine became a kind of submission. The baker didn't only serve bread, he served the city, the guild, and the law. He served expectations. The very consistency of his work became his reputation. Deviate, and one might lose everything. Stay the course, and one might survive. Not prosper, but survive. Yet even within this tight framework, there was a quiet pride. A good baker knew the feel of a perfect dough under his palms. He could judge temperature with the back of his hand, humidity by the feel of flour. He knew his customers, their preferences, their creditworthiness. He trained his sons and nephews in the trade, knowing they would inherit not only the tools, but the surveillance, the guild obligations, the long nights. He taught them how to navigate not just ovens, but rules. And there was community too. Bakers might compete, but they also helped one another. A sick baker might have his bread made by a neighbor. A flour shortage might be eased by a quiet loan from across the street. These small acts of cooperation kept the system from collapsing entirely under its own weight. They made the trade tolerable, sometimes even meaningful. By the late 18th century, murmurs of change were spreading. Revolutionary ideas questioned the privileges of guilds, the regulation of trade, and the hierarchy that had long defined every profession. For bakers, this shift was both opportunity and threat. Deregulation promised freedom but risked chaos. Many old bakeries closed, others adapted. But before that upheaval arrived, the world of regulated ovens, quiet endurance, and constant scrutiny had persisted for centuries, largely unchanged. That world didn't leave many records. Few bakers wrote memoirs. No portraits were painted of soot-covered men weighing dough at 3 a.m. But in court archives, guild minutes, and the memories of customers long gone, the imprint remains. A profession defined not by grand ambition, but by discipline, by repetition, by obedience to fire and flour, and to the silent gaze
of law. Before she became a name whispered in revolutionary history, Charlotte Corday was simply a girl in a quiet corner of France. Born in 1768 in the Normandy countryside, she spent her early years in a world that moved slowly, where the political noise from Paris barely echoed. The village of Saint-Saturne-des-Ligneries, near Caen, offered no grand stages, only the familiar routines of provincial nobility who had long since fallen into modest obscurity. Her family, though of minor aristocratic standing, was not wealthy. Her father, Jacques-François de Corday d'Armont, came from an old line but struggled with finances. The Cordays lived simply in an old manor that creaked with memory but not prosperity. When Charlotte was just 12, her mother died and the household changed. Her father, burdened with the care of several children and dwindling funds, sent Charlotte and her sister to live at the Abbey aux Dames in Caen. The abbey was not a convent in the strictest sense, but a place of quiet enclosure and religious instruction. Here, Charlotte was shaped by silence and books. The nuns who oversaw the abbey's daily rhythm offered more than spiritual guidance. They upheld a discipline of reflection, order, and reading. The library, unusually rich for an institution dedicated to women's education, held volumes of classical philosophy and Enlightenment thought. Rousseau, Plutarch, Voltaire, and more filled the shelves, and Charlotte read them with an intensity that surprised her teachers. It is important to pause here and understand what that meant. To read in 18th century France was a political act. To read Enlightenment philosophy as a young woman, aristocratic, provincial, and sheltered, was to encounter ideas that quietly challenged the very structures around her. The abbey walls remained thick and cold, but the ideas she encountered inside them had cracks running through every old assumption about power, duty, and virtue. The abbey offered more than education. It gave Charlotte a space to contemplate a life that might otherwise have been consumed by marriage or insignificance. She walked the gardens in the early hours, silent but observant. She watched the shifting moods of the seasons. She noticed how the city beyond the walls, Caen, with its market stalls, merchants, and growing political fervor, was changing. Even in this gentle place, the tremors of revolution could be felt. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Charlotte was 21. She did not rush to Paris. She did not write manifestos. She stayed in Caen. But she watched. She listened. She read the newspapers that arrived from the capital. She absorbed the debates happening in town squares and among the growing number of political clubs. Over time, her sympathies grew closer to the Girondins, a group of moderate revolutionaries who favored constitutional governance and distrusted the rising radicalism of men like Marat and Robespierre. This was a critical moment in her formation. While others were swept up in the fever of radicalism, Charlotte observed from the edge. She understood that the revolution had promised liberty, but was delivering blood. She saw the promises of Rousseau, of virtue and reason, distorted into violence, and she felt a deepening disquiet. She began to view Jean-Paul Marat, the Jacobin leader and editor of L'Ami du Peuple, as the most dangerous man in France. His writing, steeped in rage and vengeance, called for more executions, more purges, more fear. To Charlotte, he was not a leader, he was a symptom of rot. It was not hatred that began to form in her, but a cold kind of clarity. She believed that by removing one man, she could save the Republic from itself. Her reasoning was not grandiose or religious. It was pragmatic, measured, and deeply moral in her own understanding of justice. She did not expect applause. She did not even expect to live. What she did expect was impact. Yet before any of that, before the knife, the journey, the arrest, or the trial, there was this quieter life, a world of convent walls, borrowed books, long walks in cool gardens, and the faint echo of carriages in the streets of Cannes. There were the early mornings when dew hung low on the grass, and a young woman stood at a window, reading by natural light. There were conversations about ethics, about public virtue, about history's demands. There was stillness, and from this stillness, the shape of her future quietly formed. She was not a child of chaos, but of restraint. She came not from Paris's frantic streets, but from a world where thoughts were allowed to mature slowly. And perhaps that is what made her so dangerous. She did not shout, she did not runt. She believed in reason. And when reason no longer seemed to have a place in France's revolution, she decided to act. By late spring of 1793, Charlotte Corday had made her decision. It had not come in a moment of outrage, nor from the rush of political passion. Rather, it was the quiet culmination of years observing a revolution she had once believed in slowly unravel into something bitter, vindictive, and blood-soaked. She had seen the Girondins, moderates who had hoped for a republic of reason, driven out of the National Convention. She had read the names of friends and voices of restraint added to lists destined for the guillotine. And in all of this, one name appeared again and again as the rallying cry of extremism: Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was no distant villain to her. His presence bled through every newspaper, every public declaration for blood. His words carried more weight than laws. His endorsement or condemnation could mean life or death. To Charlotte, he had become the architect of terror, and no one seemed willing or able to stop him. She began to plan. She left Caen in early July 1793, telling friends and acquaintances that she was traveling to Paris on personal business. She traveled alone. It was unusual, perhaps even scandalous, for a young woman of aristocratic descent to make such a journey unaccompanied. But few questioned her. Charlotte had always been serious, composed, and seemingly harmless. The journey from Caen to Paris took several days by coach, winding through the summer landscape of a country still groaning under the weight of revolution. She brought with her few belongings, some clothing, a small amount of money, and a copy of Plutarch's Lives, a collection of biographies of ancient Roman and Greek leaders. It was this text, more than any other, that had guided her moral framework. In those stories, she saw a lineage of individual sacrifice for the greater good. In Marat, she saw a tyrant. The equation, to her, was clear.
She also carried a letter, one she wrote along the way, addressed to the French people. It explained her reasoning, calm, measured, almost judicial in tone. She did not write with passion, but with the coolness of someone who had come to a final, irreversible decision. The act she was planning, she believed, was not murder. It was prevention. Upon arriving in Paris, she took a modest room at the Hôtel de Providence, not far from the Palais Royal. It was a quiet place, and she kept to herself. She purchased a kitchen knife from a nearby shop, nothing ornate, nothing expensive. A simple blade with a wooden handle, the kind used for cutting meat or bread. For several days, she attempted to gain access to Marat. She went first to the National Convention, but was turned away. She then learned he had become seriously ill, his skin inflamed by a chronic condition, and was largely confined to his home. He spent much of his time in a medicinal bath, still writing articles, still dictating names for execution. His house had become a fortress of paranoia, but one still accessible to those who approached with care. On July 13th, 1793, Charlotte dressed plainly and made her way to his residence on Rue des Cordeliers. She brought with her a petition claiming to possess names of Girondin traitors in hiding, information she believed would gain her access. At first, she was turned away by Marat's wife, Simone Evrard, but Charlotte persisted. She returned later that day, again pleading that her information was urgent. This time, Marat agreed to receive her. She was led into his chamber. The room was humid, the air thick with medicinal herbs and steam from his bath. Marat, half submerged in water, worked from a wooden board that floated across the tub. He was pale, hunched, with sores covering his skin, a man at once frail and terrifying.
Charlotte handed him the list. He scanned it, reportedly saying something along the lines of, "They shall soon be guillotined." She reached into her dress, pulled out the knife, and stabbed him in the chest. He died within seconds, blood mingled with bath water. His scream brought Simone running, and Charlotte made no attempt to flee. She stood, knife in hand, and awaited arrest. There was no attempt at resistance, no cries, no justification beyond what she had already written in her letter. When guards arrived, they found a woman calm, unflinching, and entirely composed. She identified herself without hesitation. "I am Charlotte Corday," she reportedly said. "I have killed one man to save 100,000. News of the assassination spread quickly through Paris. Shock gave way to fury. Marat, already a controversial figure, was instantly transformed by the Jacobins into a martyr of the revolution. His bloodied bathtub became a relic. His likeness was reproduced in paintings, medals, and public mourning ceremonies.
the public narrative was reshaped to cast him as a saintly victim and Charlotte as a venomous traitor. She was imprisoned at the Conciergerie, the same prison that had housed many of those whose names Marat had written into death. She remained unrepentant even during interrogation. Her trial was swift, and though she had confessed and offered no defense, she was still questioned in public. Her answers were quiet, consistent, and unwavering. To the end, she believed her action had been one of clarity, not chaos. She had not killed in rage, but in order. She had seen the revolution losing its soul, and she had hoped to restore its conscience. Whether she succeeded or failed was not for her to decide. Her role, she believed, was to act.
The trial of Charlotte Corday began on July 17th, 1793, just 4 days after she had taken the life of Jean-Paul Marat. It was held at the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris, a place already saturated with the air of rapid judgments and political vengeance. Charlotte, at just 24 years of age, stood alone before the court. There was no defense attorney assigned, no lengthy examination of her motives, and no need for evidence. She had confessed openly, both in writing and in person. Despite the certainty of the outcome, the trial proceeded with the formalities expected of a state spectacle. She was asked to explain why she had done it. Her reply was calm and brief. "I killed one man to save 100,000. She maintained that Marat was a threat not only to the Girondins, but to the very possibility of a rational republic. Her tone throughout was composed, her eyes unblinking. Observers noted her bearing, serene, composed, almost detached. There were no cries for mercy, no attempt to paint herself as a victim of circumstance. She wore a plain dress, and her hair was tied back modestly. Even the presiding judge remarked on her poise, reportedly stating, "She has the head of a Roman." This was no accident. Corday had fashioned herself after the Stoics of antiquity, especially the Roman Brutus, who had killed Caesar to preserve the Republic. The court quickly found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death by guillotine. The sentence was to be carried out the very next day. She did not flinch at the verdict. Her only request was to be painted before her execution. She wished her likeness to be preserved, not in infamy, but in clarity. The authorities agreed, and the artist Jean-Jacques Auer was brought to her cell. He painted her while she waited, her expression quiet and reflective, her posture formal and controlled. The resulting portrait would become one of the most haunting visual records of the Revolution. A young woman on the eve of death, untouched by panic.
On July 17th, 1793, Charlotte Corday was taken by cart to the Place de la Révolution, the same square where Louis XVI and later Marie Antoinette would meet their end. The route was not long, but it was slow, designed to draw public attention. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the assassin of Marat. She stood in the cart, upright, her hands tied, but her gaze steady. Some jeered, others watched in silence. At the scaffold, she was calm. She ascended the steps without hesitation. Accounts differ on her final words. Some claim she said nothing. Others suggest she murmured a final invocation of the Republic. But what is remembered most is what happened moments after her head fell into the basket. The executioner's assistant, as was customary, lifted her severed head by the hair to show the crowd. At that moment, a witness claimed to see her cheeks flush with color, as if in defiance. This gave rise to one of the more enduring legends of the Revolution, that even in death Charlotte Corday's spirit remained unbroken. The story was repeated, embellished, and retold, giving her an eerie immortality. But the government had no interest in martyring her. While Marat's body was enshrined and paraded through Paris, Charlotte was buried in a nameless grave, unmarked and unvisited. Her name was to be erased, her deed denounced as fanaticism. Jacobin newspapers referred to her as the assassin whore, denying her any trace of nobility or rational intent. They feared her story might inspire others. They were right to worry. Within days, pamphlets both praising and condemning her began to circulate. The Girondins, though themselves under threat, quietly honored her courage. Women in particular were moved by her story, by her solitary action, by the notion that one voice, even a young woman's, could challenge power. Plays and poems were written in her memory, most banned by the authorities. Even some revolutionaries who had supported Marat grew uneasy at how quickly he had been canonized and she vilified.
Charlotte Corday became a mirror in which people saw what they wanted to see. Justice, madness, courage, arrogance. To monarchists, she was a misguided noblewoman. To Republicans, a dangerous extremist. To idealists, a tragic heroine. History, as ever, refused to settle. But what is certain is this: Charlotte Corday acted alone, with deliberation, and without desire for personal glory. She did not flee, did not recant, and did not call for a movement to follow in her wake. She had, in her mind, removed a single poison from the body politic, and accepted the price for doing so. And then silence. Her family faced scrutiny, but were not executed. Her portrait lived on. Her name faded from official records, but lingered in whispers. For a time, her grave remained unknown. Her body had been discarded quietly, like her ideals. Yet the story refused to die. In the years that followed, Corday's image would be re-examined as the revolution gave way to Thermidor, and then to Napoleon, and then to Restoration. The memory of that quiet girl from Caen persisted. She was studied in philosophy, romanticized in art, and invoked in countless political arguments as an example of what one person with enough conviction could do, whether for good or ill.
It is not for us to declare her a hero or a villain, but we can recognize her for what she was, a singular voice in a world drowning in shouting, a decision made in solitude amidst a cacophony of blood. She stood against the tide, knowing it would swallow her whole. And then she was gone. Charlotte Corday's death did not close the book on her story. Instead, it opened a long and complex chapter in the cultural memory of the French Revolution. In the immediate aftermath, the Jacobin government worked diligently to suppress any sympathetic narratives about her. Public portrayals cast her not as a tragic figure with a cause, but as a dangerous criminal, a woman who acted outside her role, out of place and out of control. The revolution had little room for nuance. Either one was for the cause or against it. Corday was the latter. Yet, as France stumbled from one upheaval to the next, her image refused to disappear. In the quiet drawing rooms of post-terror France, Corday became a subject of contemplation. Artists revisited her portrait, sometimes romanticizing her appearance, often emphasizing her calmness and resolve. Writers began to ask whether her act had been madness or moral clarity. She was increasingly compared to classical figures, Brutus, Judith, Antigone, those who committed terrible acts in the name of perceived justice. Napoleon's rise brought a shift in public priorities. Grand military victories replaced philosophical questions. Yet Corday's image lingered on, particularly in private collections and underground publications. Her calm demeanor at the scaffold became symbolic of something deeper, a person who acted from principle in a time of chaos. For some, she embodied the potential of the individual to defy tyranny. For others, she was a warning about the dangers of solitary conviction. Throughout the 19th century, Corday's legacy continued to evolve. During the Romantic period, writers and poets began to interpret her actions through a different lens. She was no longer just a political assassin. She was a woman out of step with her time, a figure of passion and tragedy, destined for destruction by the very ideals she hoped to protect. In this retelling, her gender was no longer a curiosity, but a central element. How, they asked, could a young woman act so decisively, so violently, and so alone? This tension between idealism and violence became the foundation for countless reinterpretations. In paintings, she was shown in her cell, gazing into the distance, surrounded by symbols of justice and fate. In literature, she appeared as both martyr and murderer, saint and specter. Each retelling stripped away some layers and added others, until the historical figure was buried beneath a mountain of meaning. The 20th century, with its revolutions and counter-revolutions, brought renewed interest in Corday. As ideological conflicts gripped Europe, her story was once again mined for its resonance. In some circles, she was discussed as an early feminist, a woman who stepped beyond the domestic role and claimed political agency. Violently, yes, but unmistakably. In others, she was dismissed as naive, her action ultimately futile, a disruption rather than a correction. Yet the question of motivation persisted. Did Charlotte Corday truly believe she could change the course of the revolution by removing Marat? Or did she act out of desperation, caught between her loyalties to the Girondins and her horror at the violence surrounding her? Was she a visionary, or a young woman radicalized by fear and rhetoric? The sources do not provide a single answer. Her letters are articulate, but not revealing. Her trial statements are deliberate, but carefully framed. The ambiguity is part of what has kept her story alive. Modern scholarship has approached Corday with greater nuance. Historians now examine her through the lenses of gender, ideology, and media. They explore how her story was shaped not only by her own choices, but by those who recorded, painted, judged, and mythologized her. In this light, Charlotte becomes not just an actor in history, but a canvas onto which generations have projected their hopes and anxieties about revolution, morality, and the role of women in public life. There is also the matter of her final resting place. For many years, the location of her grave remained uncertain. Though executed in Paris, her body was reportedly buried in the Madeleine Cemetery, a site later disturbed and redeveloped. Today, there is no definitive marker, no monument, no epitaph, only stories and silence. And still, Charlotte Corday appears in novels, plays, operas, even political debates. She has been invoked by both conservatives and radicals, feminists and traditionalists, Republicans and royalists. Each finds something in her that reflects their values or fears. Each builds a different version of the same woman. But perhaps her legacy is best understood not in terms of who she was, but what she represented. She was the embodiment of a question that remains unresolved. Can one act of violence committed for the sake of peace ever be justified? She believed the answer was yes. History has offered no clear reply. In the end, Charlotte Corday left no movement behind her, no followers, no school of thought, only the echo of her decision made in solitude, carried across centuries. When the revolution burned brightest, hers was the steady hand that plunged the blade, not for vengeance, not for fame, but for something quieter, more abstract. She died believing that her action would restore balance. Whether she was right is something history has yet to decide. In the decades leading up to the French Revolution, the dining tables of France's elite bore little resemblance to the modest hearths of its commoners. This was the age of Rococo, a style defined by ornamentation, delicacy, and a kind of cultivated impracticality. Nowhere was that more evident than in the cuisine of the upper class. At its core, Rococo cuisine wasn't about nourishment, it was about display. A successful meal was judged not by how satisfying it was, but by how artfully it paraded status, refinement, and excess. Dishes were built in layers, both literally and socially. The ingredients, techniques, and presentation had to speak of wealth and access. They had to whisper, or sometimes shout that this table belonged to someone who mattered. Menus could stretch into dozens of courses, yet these were not the hearty dishes of rustic abundance. Portions were small, elaborate, and ephemeral. A bite of fish suspended in a delicate aspic, a single poached pear carved into the shape of a rose, a confection designed to collapse at the touch of a spoon. These weren't meals as sustenance, they were fleeting performances. And yet, beneath the gilt and glaze, something stranger lurked. Preservation techniques were rudimentary. Refrigeration didn't exist. Even in noble households, the freshness of meat, fish, or dairy was a daily gamble. Kitchens teemed with activity, but also with pests. Mice and insects were a common part of the environment, and while staff did their best to keep them away from the food, their presence was often tolerated rather than eradicated. Spices, once rare, were used not just for flavor, but to mask the beginnings of rot. Nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon became routine additions to savory dishes, not because they complemented the taste, but because they overpowered the hints of spoilage. In wealthy homes, sauces were the great equalizer. A sauce could redeem a questionable piece of meat. A glaze could disguise the fatigue of fish.
Odd ingredients abounded, not all because of necessity, some due to fashion. Ambergris, a substance produced in the digestive tract of whales, was prized for its musky aroma and added to desserts. Musk from deer glands was considered an exotic addition to fine syrups. Gold leaf was sometimes applied to pastries, not for taste, of course, but as a culinary form of jewelry. Texture was as important as flavor. Cooks strained and restrained broths until they shimmered with clarity. Chefs shaped purees into geometrical molds and constructed towers of candied fruit held together with threads of spun sugar. Culinary competition was fierce, especially among noble households vying for status. Hiring a renowned cook was a declaration, a social maneuver. Food was often prepared in advance, even hours before serving, and then left inside chambers to await guests. As a result, temperatures fluctuated. Dishes that were meant to be warm arrived cool. Those meant to be chilled arrived tepid. The silver trays and porcelain dishes retained heat poorly, and often appearance mattered more than optimal serving conditions. The eating experience itself was ritualistic. Formal dinners could stretch for hours, punctuated by conversation, fanfare, and spectacle. Diners didn't always consume every dish placed before them. It was enough that the food had been offered, admired, and acknowledged. In some homes, it was fashionable to serve food that no one touched, centerpieces of culinary architecture, there to be seen but not eaten. The gap between classes widened most visibly at the table. While the rural poor subsisted on bread, onions, and porridge, aristocrats dined on dishes that required dozens of hands to prepare.
This dissonance was felt most acutely in Paris, where opulent salons sat just blocks away from hungry neighborhoods. As food riots began to erupt in the late 18th century, more than one noble found themselves peering out a lace curtain window while chewing on a sugared violet, watching crowds form below.
The absurdity of some Rococo meals was not lost on critics of the time. Satirical pamphlets mocked the aristocrats for consuming molded quails in marzipan nests, or soup served inside hollowed-out turnips. One popular cartoon depicted a nobleman asleep at the table, surrounded by a pyramid of untouched dishes, while his servants snuck bites in the shadows. Despite its extravagance, Rococo cuisine laid the foundation for later culinary innovation. The emphasis on presentation, balance, and multi-course structure would evolve, refined by chefs who later embraced simplification without losing elegance. But the period itself remained marked by contradiction, a hunger for status amid a growing hunger for food. As the century waned, the tides turned, revolution loomed, and with it came a new rhetoric, one of equality, frugality, and rejection of excess. The grand kitchens emptied, the dining halls silenced. Silver platters were melted for coin. Chefs who once worked for dukes found themselves cooking in taverns or fleeing the country altogether. And still, the memory of that cuisine lingered, in recipes copied into notebooks, in crumbling illustrations of sugar towers, and in the quiet disdain of a populace that had come to see luxury not as aspiration, but as obscenity.
While 18th century French cuisine dazzled with elegance and artistic presentation, the reality of its ingredients often stood in stark contrast to the glittering halls where it was consumed. Beneath the sugar-dusted surface, food safety was a fragile illusion, one that the wealthy rarely acknowledged and that the poor never had the luxury to question. Spoilage was an omnipresent concern, especially in urban kitchens where food had to be transported from rural farms or distant markets into the city. The journey was not kind to perishables. Meat, fish, milk, and eggs, items we today take for granted in refrigerated trucks, were transported in baskets or barrels, sometimes packed with straw, but always vulnerable to time, temperature, and handling. By the time ingredients arrived at noble households or city taverns, freshness was no longer a guarantee. The signs of spoilage were familiar: a sour scent from poultry, discoloration on cuts of beef, or a slippery film over fish flesh. But in the Rococo era, such imperfections did not necessarily disqualify an ingredient. Instead, chefs relied on culinary sleight of hand, cutting away the worst parts, soaking questionable cuts in vinegar, or submerging fish in wine and citrus in an attempt to refresh their aroma. Preservation efforts extended beyond simple coping. There were techniques that, while primitive, were widely employed. Salting, smoking, and drying were common, but they altered the food's texture and flavor in ways the aristocracy didn't always appreciate. As a result, elaborate masking techniques became the norm.
Spices played a central role here, not just for their taste, but for their ability to overpower natural decay. Cloves, pepper, nutmeg, and mace were prized not because they complemented meat, but because they concealed its decline. Milk was particularly tricky. Without refrigeration, it soured quickly, especially in the summer months. As a result, cheeses were the preferred method of preservation, but even they were risky. Molds grew indiscriminately, and while some were desirable, blue veining in certain varieties, others hinted at rot. Still, in the upper classes, the appearance of a lavish cheese board was non-negotiable, even if it meant including wheels with questionable integrity.
Eggs, too, were unreliable. With no way to properly test for freshness, cooks relied on folklore, such as floating an egg in water, to assess their viability. Yet these tests weren't always reliable, and the inclusion of a rotten egg in a batter or custard could spoil an entire dish. In poorer kitchens, eggs were sometimes used regardless of freshness, their sulphurous tinge diluted with sugar and spice to create something palatable. Bread, the daily staple, was not exempt from concern. In theory, it was the most reliable of foods, simple, filling, and easily stored. But in practice, bakers under pressure to stretch their flour supplies sometimes adulterated dough with additives. Chalk, bone dust, powdered stone, or even ground bark found their way into loaves. These materials were chosen for their appearance, white and fine, mimicking flour, but they offered no nutritional value and in many cases caused stomach distress or worse. The authorities knew of these practices, and periodic crackdowns ensued. Inspectors might randomly cut open loaves, looking for texture inconsistencies or strange inclusions. If caught, bakers were fined or publicly shamed. Still, the demand for cheap bread outweighed enforcement. In lean years, with wheat prices soaring and riots brewing, even reputable bakers were tempted to cut corners. And then there were the culinary curiosities, those ingredients that hovered on the edge of acceptability. Animal brains, marrow, lungs, and blood were used in all manner of savory dishes. These weren't considered oddities in and of themselves, but in wealthier kitchens their presence was disguised. A brain might be pureed into a custard, blood thickened into a sauce and masked with wine and spices. Texture was modified through sieving or folding in creams. What might revolt in raw form was transformed into velvety smoothness. Seafood presented its own complications. Shellfish, highly perishable, were considered a delicacy, but they spoiled faster than almost anything else. The odor of aging oysters or mussels was unmistakable. Still, some hosts insisted on serving them hours after purchase. The results were occasionally dire. Nausea, fever, and food poisoning were attributed to bad air or seasonal vapors, rather than the simple reality of consuming spoiled clams.
The fascination with exotic imports also contributed to questionable choices. Ingredients like tamarind, cardamom, and even dried insects were imported and used to flavor confections. Though prized, their handling was inconsistent. Spoiled shipments weren't always discarded. They were sometimes dried further or processed into powders, the assumption being that any impurity could be cooked out. This assumption was incorrect. Coloring agents introduced further risks. To achieve vibrant greens or sunny yellows in sweets and sauces, cooks occasionally turned to mineral-based dyes. Copper salts, for example, were sometimes used to maintain green hues in vegetables, a practice that could lead to poisoning over time. Lead-based additives, while less common, still found their way into the culinary lexicon, often under the guise of decorative shine. Yet, amidst all this, the culinary arts advanced. Recipes were copied and passed down. Cookbooks began to circulate beyond noble kitchens, spreading both dangerous shortcuts and valuable techniques. Trial and error slowly separated the deadly from the merely unappetizing. And behind the scenes, a quiet revolution was brewing, not in politics, but in hygiene. Some chefs began advocating for cleanliness, washing hands before cooking, scalding utensils, airing out pantries. These ideas were not yet mainstream, but they appeared in the private notes of forward-thinking cooks. Still, for most kitchens of the period, cleanliness was more aesthetic than practical. Floors might be swept and brass polished, but if a rat ran under the counter or a cockroach appeared near the fruit basket, the work continued. The result was a duality. Rococo cuisine was both a high art and a dangerous gamble. Behind every shimmering dish lay hours of labor, and behind that, the quiet risk of illness. Diners rarely considered it. They were too absorbed in the flape of pastry, the glisten of glaze, the performance of abundance. That the feast might be laced with chalk, or the cream harboring spoilage, was not their concern. Their appetite was not for sustenance, but spectacle. And like all spectacles, what lay behind the curtain was rarely pretty.
In the carefully arranged dining halls of 18th century France, food was not merely sustenance, it was declaration. Each course, each garnish, each imported spice became a line in an unspoken language of power. The dishes laid out upon the table were as much about messaging as they were about nourishment. And nowhere was this more evident than in the elite Rococo dining experience. The symbolic value of cuisine during this period cannot be overstated. The food one served, or was served, spoke volumes about their class, education, and political alignment. Certain dishes marked you as traditionalist, others as reform-minded. Some were chosen to suggest moderation, others to hint at opulence. And layered within this performative gastronomy were messages understood only by those initiated in the rituals of courtly behavior. One of the most prominent examples was the use of luxury ingredients as status signifiers. Consider the truffle, an ingredient with no striking color or shape, and yet revered. Its earthy aroma and elusive cultivation made it a marker of exclusivity. Truffles were often shaved delicately over eggs or meat, not for their flavor alone, but to remind guests that the host had access to such rarities. In much the same way, sugar sculptures, elaborate centerpieces molded from molded caramel and spun sugar, had more to do with showing wealth and less to do with being eaten. Similarly, imported spices like saffron, cinnamon, and even vanilla carried connotations that extended far beyond the palate. A dish flavored with cinnamon was not simply tasty. It was a quiet statement of global reach, of trade routes maintained, colonies possessed, and connections secured. In a time when the average Parisian barely tasted salt, a meal imbued with nutmeg hinted at unspoken influence. The political implications extended into the way food was served. The act of plating, now considered a creative flourish, was in Rococo France an assertion of hierarchy. In noble houses, dishes were often served in a style called service à la française, where many dishes were laid on the table simultaneously, requiring guests to choose and serve themselves or be served by servants. This created subtle moments of observation. Did the guest reach for the simplest fare or the most ostentatious? Did they wait to be offered or help themselves? Each gesture was weighed.
The timing of meals also reflected one's alignment. The old aristocracy often maintained older, slower dining habits, preferring long, multi-course meals that began in late afternoon. The rising bourgeoisie, by contrast, embraced a more modern dining structure, punctual, efficient, and divided into fewer courses. To delay or rush a meal could thus be interpreted, politically, as conservative nostalgia or progressive ambition. One curious artifact of this culinary signaling was the rising popularity of white food. In the decades before the Revolution, pale sauces, creams, and subtly colored dishes became all the rage among the upper crust. It was said that the color white reflected purity, refinement, and restraint. More practically, it also showed that one could afford the freshest cream, the finest flour, and the least adulterated sugar. Blandness, in this context, was luxury. Even table settings were imbued with messaging. The presence of porcelain from China or Meissen indicated connections to wealth and international trade. Pewter or silver spoons showed a step below, but were still respectable. The fork, still a relative novelty in parts of France, was used differently among social classes. The way one held a utensil, prongs up, knife under, spoke of education and upbringing. There was, of course, another layer to this entire spectacle: exclusion. The poorest members of society would never taste saffron, would never dine beneath crystal chandeliers, or know the difference between a consommé and a bisque. Yet they were not entirely unaware of these rituals. Pamphlets, plays, and public accounts of noble excess circulated widely, especially in the years leading up to the Revolution. Satirical works mocked the absurdities of elite dining, and whispered tales of waste and decadence traveled quickly through market stalls and bakeries. Food, then, became a battleground, not just of flavors or access, but of morality. When a noble family ordered 10-course feasts during a grain shortage, it was not merely indulgence, it was seen as moral failing. The symbolism embedded in their meals began to backfire. That duck glazed in pomegranate reduction no longer represented culture, it represented ignorance, detachment, and to some, tyranny.
This resentment was not unfounded. At the height of the Rococo era, some estates burned through more food in a single evening than entire villages might consume in a week.
Records from noble household ledgers tell of weeks where dozens of chickens, pounds of sugar, and barrels of imported wines were consumed without pause. This extravagance, once admired, gradually became repugnant in the eyes of a population growing hungry and restless. Even within the elite, food as politics created tension. The hosting of a rival family, for example, required careful planning. No dish should outshine the guest's previous event too obviously, lest offense be taken. An abbot arriving at court must not be served richer fare than a visiting general. At Versailles, where hundreds dined daily under watchful eyes, placement at the table could reflect one's proximity to royal favor. To be given the wrong cut of meat, or to wait too long for a servant's attention, was interpreted as social slippage. And yet, amid all this, the artistry of food remained. Chefs in noble kitchens were not merely cooks, they were artists, diplomats, and performers. Their recipes were refined through trial, error, and instinct. Their dishes reflected not only flavor and texture, but seasonality, availability, and shifting cultural winds. A tart served in winter was suspect. A chilled soup served in spring was appropriate. These nuances were not always spoken of directly, but they were felt. As the revolution drew closer, the symbolism of food became increasingly potent. Bread riots, grain hoarding, and food scarcity made the very act of eating political. The aristocracy's tables, once admired, now seemed obscene. What had once been a symbol of refinement, subtle sauces, delicate pastries, had become a symbol of callousness. Food no longer simply tasted of herbs or broth, it tasted of injustice.
In the grand dining halls of 18th century France, where silver clinked softly against porcelain and conversations flowed as carefully as the wine, the food that graced noble tables often teetered on the fine line between culinary artistry and biological risk. Behind the spectacle of refined sauces and ornamental centerpieces lay a less discussed reality: spoilage, questionable preservation methods, and an evolving relationship with what it meant for food to be safe. The Rococo period embraced aesthetic abundance, but food storage techniques had not caught up with ambition. Without refrigeration or reliable cold storage, even the wealthiest households faced a race against time. Meats, dairy, and even vegetables were susceptible to rapid decay, especially during summer months. Chefs and servants relied on cellars, ice pits, and salting rooms, but the effectiveness of these solutions varied. An undercured ham could turn within hours. A crate of figs, arriving late from Marseille, might arrive moldy despite its price. Preservation, then, was both a science and a gamble. Salt was used liberally, not only to enhance flavor, but to draw out moisture and prolong shelf life. Fish, especially cod and herring, were routinely dried or packed in brine. Meats were smoked or immersed in vinegar-based marinades. Yet none of these methods guaranteed success. The resulting textures were often tough, the flavors sharp or acrid. But in a time where fresh was fleeting, the presence of aged or preserved foods signaled preparation, resourcefulness, and, paradoxically, refinement. Cheese was a particular subject of both delight and danger.
The French passion for aged cheese flourished, but without modern bacterial understanding, these delicacies sometimes ventured into precarious territory. Blue-veined varieties, such as Roquefort, were revered for their complexity, even as some guests declined them for fear of indigestion. The line between maturation and decomposition was not always clear. Some cheeses were allowed to crawl with mites, a practice seen not as a defect, but a regional specialty. The presence of movement on the surface was not necessarily grounds for disposal, particularly if the smell was deemed acceptable.
Fruits, when not preserved as jams or cordials, were consumed as quickly as possible. Noble kitchens employed teams of servants to peel, pit, and boil fruits into syrups or pastes, trapping the sweetness before it could ferment. Quince paste, pear preserves, and cherry brandy were not only enjoyed at the table, but served as tokens of wealth. Glass jars of preserved fruits might decorate pantries as much as serve them. Yet even these sugary efforts sometimes failed, resulting in jars that hissed ominously when opened, or whose contents bubbled strangely under the lid. Curiously, the perception of decay was not as universally negative as modern diners might assume. The idea of food being aged to perfection had currency. Game meats were often hung for days, even weeks, to tenderize them. A slightly pungent aroma was not automatically repellent. It was interpreted as character. Similarly, sauces with fermented fish or anchovy base, such as Garam's descendants, were considered sophisticated. Flavor complexity often stemmed from ingredients that had been left to steep, ferment, or border on spoilage. Mold, too, was not always a villain. While dangerous molds were poorly understood, certain types were tolerated and even cultivated. Bread molds occasionally appeared in larders, but unless visibly spreading or causing illness, they might be scraped away and dismissed. The presence of mold on wine corks or around barrel rims was not alarming. It was simply part of the aging process. In some elite circles, the musty scent of a cellar was romanticized, even celebrated. Yet foodborne illness remained a constant shadowy threat. While nobles were more insulated from famine and starvation, they were not immune to bad food. Diaries and letters occasionally mentioned mysterious bouts of stomach distress or extended illness following feasts. The true causes, contaminated butter, spoiled cream, or undercooked poultry, were rarely identified with precision. Instead, explanations often turned to imbalance of humors, bad air, or simple misfortune. Doctors might prescribe herbal teas, enemas, or purging agents, rather than investigate the stew. One of the more curious methods of masking decay was the strategic use of spices. Nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, and pepper were not just flavorings. They served to overpower less pleasant undertones. A roast that had turned slightly might still be served, provided it was dressed in a pungent sauce. The heavy use of aromatic herbs, tarragon, rosemary, thyme, was not merely for taste, but for camouflage. A dish's success sometimes depended on whether its true age could be disguised beneath fragrance and flair. The aesthetics of presentation also played a role in softening perception. A suspicious pâté might be molded into the shape of a swan or encased in an ornate crust. Glazes made from gelatin or aspic could conceal imperfections. Edible flowers were scattered across platters, not just for color, but to distract from irregularities. Guests, seated amid chandeliers and tapestries, were less likely to scrutinize what lay beneath layers of sugar or gold leaf. Despite this, rumors of culinary transgressions circulated. Whispers of foodborne deaths, of sickened guests at court, and of cooks imprisoned for negligence found their way into pamphlets and gossip. These were rarely confirmed, but persisted nonetheless. The tension between splendor and spoilage never fully disappeared. Ultimately, the kitchens of Rococo France existed in a fragile balance. They were palaces of invention and improvisation, sustained by habit, instinct, and a willingness to overlook certain realities. Behind every elegant course was a servant who had sniffed, scraped, and taken a risk. Behind every polished silver dome was a chef who hoped no one would notice the cheese had turned. In the age of powdered wigs and perfumed letters, even the food wore a disguise.
To walk the halls of Versailles in the 18th century was to enter a world of curated illusion. Beneath ceilings painted with gods and heroes, amid mirrors that reflected candlelight into infinity, the court of France enacted a daily theater of opulence. But it was in the details, in the rustle of silk, the clink of glass, the low murmur of etiquette-bound conversation, that the true machinery of Versailles revealed itself. Here, parties weren't diversions, they were governance. Fashion wasn't vanity, it was policy. The palace itself, stretching across gardens and courtyards, was designed not merely as a royal residence, but as a statement of control. Every brick and fountain, every embroidered curtain and gilded frame served to remind the visitor this was not ordinary life. Within its salons and antechambers, society was choreographed with precision. No one moved without purpose. No one dressed without calculation. The court calendar was dense with events, masquerades, suppers, musicales, and levees. Attendance was both privilege and obligation. A missed evening could imply disfavor or disinterest, and invitations were currency. The king's presence or absence dictated the hierarchy of attention. A nobleman arriving too early risked appearing overeager. Too late, and he might be barred entry altogether. The ideal arrival was measured, calculated to reflect both deference and self-possession. Attire for such events was a serious affair. A noble's wardrobe could consume a significant portion of their annual income, with silks imported from Lyon or Venice, lace from Bruges, and dyes from the colonies. Dresses for women were structured and immense, often requiring assistance just to move through doors. Hoop skirts expanded like furniture, bodices constricted posture into elegance. Men's coats were embroidered with metallic thread, their stockings chosen to match the particular lighting of the evening. Powdered wigs were not merely worn, but sculpted, taller, more curled, more adorned, depending on the fashion of the season. What one wore said everything about rank, allegiance, ambition. To wear last season's style was to confess irrelevance. To wear a shade reserved for royalty, however unintentionally, was to commit a social offense. Tailors and modistes acted as intermediaries between reputation and ruin, their work scrutinized not only for craftsmanship, but for symbolic correctness. The parties themselves were studies in spectacle. Candlelit halls glowed with warm light, reflected endlessly by chandeliers and mirrors. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies, sweetmeats sculpted into miniature temples, jellied fruits suspended in glassy molds, pastries shaped like swans or towers. Music wafted from string quartets tucked behind screens, their presence felt more than seen. Conversation flowed in murmurs, punctuated by polite laughter or the rustle of fans. Yet this was not relaxation. These gatherings were work, social labor conducted under surveillance. Every gesture mattered, who one greeted first, how long one lingered in a conversation, whether one bowed or curtsied at the proper angle. Courtiers memorized protocols with the precision of dancers. A misplaced glance or an accidental snub could cost influence, patronage, even inheritance. There were no true private moments. Even laughter had its place. A joke that pleased the king might lift a family's fortunes. A poorly timed remark could exile a guest to the provinces. Intrigues blossomed not in whispers, but in glances across the ballroom, in subtle shifts of seating, in a single night's pairing on the dance floor. Silk was the common thread running through it all. The fabric's sheen, its movement, its rustle. It was the language of visibility. The wealthier the silk, the louder the message. Courtiers traded stories of bankruptcies caused by fashion, of families ruined by the need to impress. Yet few dared scale back. To do so was to fade from view, and in Versailles, invisibility was worse than scandal.
Perfume masked more than sweat. It masked ambition, desperation, hunger. Layers of powder and rouge concealed not only blemishes, but emotion. The painted face was armor. Tears, when they came, were shed privately, behind closed doors, or not at all. The dancers spun through minuets as if floating, but the choreography was laden with significance. Certain patterns allowed for more eye contact, others enforced distance. Couples were paired strategically. Young heirs were introduced through a shared step. Rumors passed between movements. A single touch, held too long or too briefly, could ignite weeks of gossip. Outside, the gardens echoed the interior's precision. Gravel paths traced geometric patterns. Fountains burst at appointed hours. Even the moonlit air seemed cultivated. But few lingered outside for long. The real power lay indoors, under gilt ceilings and under watchful eyes. As dawn approached, the grand salons emptied. Servants appeared like ghosts, extinguishing candles, collecting glassware, gathering forgotten gloves. The guests retreated to chambers or carriages, their faces stiff with fatigue, their minds parsing the evening signals. And tomorrow, it would all begin again.
To exist at Versailles was not to live in the traditional sense. It was to perform. Every waking moment, every step, gesture, or word was governed by an invisible web of rules and expectations that shaped one's access to power. Even those born into noble bloodlines found themselves navigating a maze of etiquette so intricate, so brittle, that one misstep could erase generations of favor. In this gilded world, it was not wealth or charm alone that determined your place. It was the ritual of presence. The concept of présence in the royal court was more than physical attendance. It was a measured visibility, a delicate art of being seen by the right people in the right places at the right times. To be absent, even for valid reasons, was to risk being forgotten. To be overly present, however, could be seen as grasping or vulgar. The balance was razor thin, and everyone knew it. Versailles itself was designed to support this social architecture. The palace offered no true privacy, no escape from scrutiny. Hallways echoed with passing conversations. Antechambers blurred the line between waiting and watching. Even bedrooms, nominally private, could be entered without warning by servants, messengers, or rivals pretending to be lost. Visibility was everything, and the court thrived on its theater. At the center of it all was the king. His presence, or more precisely, your proximity to it, dictated your worth. Courtiers jostled, quietly but relentlessly, for access. The most coveted moment was the levee, the king's ceremonial awakening. A handful of nobles were permitted to assist in his dressing, each role allocated by rank and favor. One might pass the shirt, another the stockings, a third the comb. These gestures were not about service, they were about status. To be trusted with a sleeve was to be part of the king's inner circle.
But this favor was never permanent. The king might promote a newcomer or withdraw an old ally without warning. Alliances formed and dissolved like mist. A whispered remark from a favorite, a frown during a musical performance, even an ill-timed absence from a hunt could tilt the balance. Much of this tension played out through spatial choreography. Rooms at Versailles were assigned based on hierarchy, with closer quarters to the king's apartment indicating higher favor. A noble assigned to a chamber far from the central galleries might as well have been banished. Staircases became symbols of access. To descend the marble staircase at the same time as a favored minister was to be noticed or avoided, depending on the climate of the day. Meals followed their own rituals. During public dinners, members of the royal family dined on an elevated platform, while the nobility stood and watched, murmuring among themselves. Even eating became a performance. One's posture, utensils, and expressions were silently judged.
The ability to engage in polite conversation while appearing neither too hungry nor too disinterested was an essential skill. And yet, survival at court demanded more than compliance. It demanded fluency in a language of signals, subtle and coded. A glance across the garden, a bow that lasted a second longer than necessary, a comment about lace that, to the informed ear, referenced political alliances. Gossip was currency. Wit was the weapon. One could win favor not just by birthright, but by deploying charm in precisely the right register.
Women navigated this terrain with particular finesse. Forbidden from holding formal office, they wielded influence through salons, fashion, and patronage. A duchess could sponsor a playwright, host a poetry reading, or align herself with a faction, all without leaving her drawing room. Some women rose to astonishing levels of informal power, guiding political decisions through conversation alone. Others fell just as quickly, undone by scandal, innuendo, or the shifting loyalties of men. Religious observance, too, was political. Attending Mass, or not attending it, marked you. A display of piety could be read as ambition. Failing to kneel at the right moment might be seen as arrogance or heresy. Even charitable acts, donations, visits to convents, support for orphanages were calibrated. Too much charity, and you seemed sanctimonious. Too little, and you seemed cold. This constant surveillance extended to leisure. One did not simply walk in the gardens. One promenaded. One did not merely play music. One performed. Every activity was a signal. A preference for Italian opera might link you to foreign sympathies. A passion for hunting might bond you with a warlike faction. Even pets became symbolic. A lady's lapdog might be a political message in fur. There were, of course, those who resisted. A few nobles, weary of the theater, retreated to country estates. They risked irrelevance, but gained peace. Others played the system with dazzling success, manipulating it for power, wealth, and security. But most courtiers existed somewhere in between, alert, exhausted, calculating. And beneath it all was the understanding that none of it lasted. The king aged, tastes changed. A revolution was whispering at the edges of society, though no one yet recognized it. For now, the game continued. The candles were lit. The silk was pressed. The mirrors reflected ambition back upon itself. The rules of presence held, for now.
For every noble lounging beneath Versailles' golden ceilings, for every powdered wig that graced a gallery or garden promenade, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of invisible hands ensuring that illusion held firm. These hands did not belong to dukes or duchesses, but to the army of servants who made court life possible. Their names were rarely recorded, their faces seldom painted, and yet without their constant, careful labor, Versailles would have collapsed under the weight of its own extravagance. The Palace of Versailles was, in the 18th century, not just a royal residence, it was a city. Thousands lived within or near its walls, nobles, guards, cooks, maids, musicians, architects, laundresses, grooms, and countless others.
Each had a function, a role, a corridor they knew better than their own names. The hierarchy among the servants mirrored that of the court they served. Some lived in attic rooms barely large enough to lie down in. Others, particularly those serving the royal family directly, held enviable positions with rooms, uniforms, and wages. But all of them were bound to the unceasing rhythm of courtly maintenance. At the highest rank of domestic service were the valets and ladies' maids of the royal household. Their tasks were intimate and often complex, dressing the monarch, preparing bathing water, managing delicate linens, lacing corsets, arranging wardrobes by occasion, season, and status. They were expected to be invisible until needed and omnipresent when summoned. Many knew secrets that could ruin reputations. Discretion, therefore, was a vital skill, one just as important as folding silk or tightening a wig ribbon. Beneath these attendants came a network of specialized laborers, bakers who rose before dawn to provide fresh bread, gardeners who trimmed hedges before sunrise, footmen who stood motionless for hours beside banquet tables, alert for the slightest gesture from a noble, housekeepers who oversaw dozens of undermaids, each responsible for dusting, scrubbing, and polishing without ever disturbing the delicate order of things.
The kitchens alone operated like a miniature court, with a head chef equivalent to a general and scullions ranking near the bottom. The food preparation at Versailles was a matter of pride and politics. Dozens of courses had to be timed precisely, presented flawlessly, and carried swiftly through an enormous network of passageways and stairs so that they arrived hot and untouched. Mistakes were not only inconvenient, they were public and punishable. Laundry posed its own challenges, with silks, velvets, and lace a constant part of court attire. Washing required expertise. Many garments could not be soaked or wrung. Instead, they were cleaned by hand, patted with absorbent cloths, scented delicately, and aired on frames. Laundresses worked long hours with little recognition, managing loads of fabric more expensive than anything they'd ever wear. The floors of Versailles, marble, parquet, or tiled, were polished daily, despite the foot traffic. Chamber pots had to be emptied discreetly, candles trimmed and replaced, fires stoked in the vast drafty halls, mirrors polished, tapestries shaken, silver polished to gleam. These tasks were expected to occur without being seen. The ideal servant left no trace, neither of labor nor of themselves. Communication between servants operated in its own language: soft knocks, coded glances, known rhythms of footfall. A certain way of setting down a tray might signal that a guest had overstayed their welcome. A subtle cough might warn of an approaching rival. Over time, servants developed entire systems of silent efficiency to navigate the social minefield of Versailles.
And yet, for all their effort, recognition was rare. A misplaced spoon could result in reprimand. A wrinkled curtain might invite suspicion. Many lived in fear of dismissal, which could mean ruin, not only loss of income, but of housing, social standing, and future prospects. Some servants clung to their roles for generations, entire families growing up within the palace, each child trained to replace the parent in silent, skilled service. Despite the pressure, bonds formed in these shadows.
Servants often relied on one another in ways their masters never saw. They shared food, news, and warmth. They helped cover each other's mistakes, mended each other's uniforms, whispered warnings of changes in mood or power among the nobles. They watched the court not with admiration, but with wary detachment, understanding it more completely than the players themselves. Some servants climbed the ranks. A valet favored by a powerful noble might receive gifts, influence, or even a small property. Others escaped entirely, using what they'd seen to write memoirs, advise revolutionaries, or expose court excesses. The knowledge gained in silence became, in rare cases, a path to voice. But most remained exactly where they were, figures glimpsed only in passing reflections, heard only in the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind a silk curtain. Their work, constant and consuming, sustained the palace and its illusions. While nobles discussed poetry, philosophy, and war, it was servants who ensured the fire didn't go out, the windows stayed clean, the bed was made just so. And when Versailles eventually fell, when the revolution swept away its ceremonies and structure, it was these same hands that quietly unlocked doors, carried out trunks, and swept the final embers from hearths once warmed by kings. In history, their names are seldom recorded, but their labor remains, woven into the seams of gowns, the polish on banisters, the echo of footsteps in marble halls.
While the public imagination often conjures Versailles as a place of constant grandeur, gleaming halls, masked balls, and powdered courtiers gliding through salons, there was another rhythm pulsing beneath that surface. The slow, deliberate passage of the seasons and the rituals that accompanied them. For all its artifice and luxury, court life was not without structure. In fact, it was defined by it. Every moment, gesture, and event operated within a larger framework, one dictated not only by etiquette, but by time itself. The year at Versailles was not just measured by the calendar. It was punctuated by feast days, religious observances, hunting seasons, name days, royal birthdays, and agricultural events in the surrounding lands. These moments determined what was served on the table, what was worn in the salons, what music was played in the chambers, and even who appeared at court. Winter, for instance, was a time of relative stillness. The great gardens, stripped of their color, remained elegant but bare. Courtiers spent more time indoors, gathered near fireplaces in heavy fabrics. Indoor entertainments flourished. Card games, poetry readings, musical performances by candlelight. The season lent itself to formality and introspection. Meals were heavier, wine was mulled, velvet replaced silk. Firewood, although abundant for the elite, remained a quiet reminder of the world outside the palace walls, where many faced brutal cold. Spring ushered in renewal, not only of nature, but of court life itself. Floral motifs returned to clothing and interiors. The gardens were replanted, and long walks through the Trianon became fashionable once more. Court painters often chose this season to immortalize nobility among blossoming trees, capturing not just beauty, but the symbolic return of life and hope.
Spring feasts emphasized freshness, asparagus, herbs, young lamb. Dances were lighter in tone. Composers favored flutes and strings over the deeper tones of winter's orchestras. Summer brought heat, and with it, a shift in both mood and geography. The court would sometimes relocate to cooler areas of the palace or retreat to the Grand Trianon. Outdoor events dominated: boating on the Grand Canal, hunting parties in the surrounding forests, elaborate picnics beneath linen awnings. Fabrics lightened. Meals shifted toward fruits, chilled pastries, and lighter wines. The long days allowed for later suppers, and nighttime fireworks over the gardens became common, echoes of celebration that reflected in the palace's many mirrored halls. Autumn was a time of harvest and retreat. The mood turned reflective again. Hunting was in full swing, particularly for the king and his favored nobles. Tables brimmed with game, preserved fruits, and hearty dishes. Courtiers brought out deeper hues in their attire: browns, reds, ochres, and poetry turned toward themes of nostalgia and transience. In many ways, this season encapsulated the duality of Versailles, the abundance on display, and the quiet understanding that time moved on, even within golden walls. Overlaying this seasonal rhythm were the fixed rituals that marked court life regardless of month. Chief among them was the lever, or royal rising. Each morning the king awoke in public, surrounded by selected nobles who had earned the right to assist in his dressing. This was not simply a morning routine. It was a carefully choreographed assertion of hierarchy. The order in which nobles entered the room, their assigned roles, their distance from the royal bed, all of it reflected their standing. The couche, or royal bedtime, operated similarly. In both, the mundane act of waking or sleeping became political theater. To be present was to be powerful. To be excluded was to fade. These ceremonies emphasized that in Versailles, even rest was ritualized. Meals, too, were public affairs. While private dining was not unheard of, the grand couvert, a public royal dinner, was a performance. Nobles and visitors would gather to watch the king and his family eat. Silence reigned, except for the quiet clink of silver and the shuffling of servants. The spectacle wasn't about conversation or indulgence. It was about presence, about order, about reminding all who watched that the monarchy sat at the center of the universe, calmly consuming its supper, while others remained on their feet.
Religious observance played a significant role in the rhythm of court life. Daily mass was expected. Confession, communion, and the observation of saints' days marked the spiritual calendar. The royal chapel hosted grand services on special occasions, with music composed by court musicians and sung by choirs trained within the palace. Faith was not simply personal, it was institutional, performative, and central to legitimacy. A monarch who did not kneel in public lost more than favor. He risked his throne. Yet not all rituals were solemn. Many were deeply social.
name days, celebrations of the saint after whom someone was named, became occasions for feasting and gift-giving. Salon nights, hosted by powerful noblewomen, offered opportunities for poets, philosophers, and courtiers to mingle and debate. These events shaped caste, alliances, and rumor. A clever turn of phrase delivered in the right salon could elevate a writer overnight. A misstep might doom a reputation for years. Amid this choreography of time, fashion provided visual cues to the passage of events. Court dress changed with both season and occasion. Mourning periods required specific colors and fabrics. Royal births inspired new trends. Even the weather might dictate an adjustment in sleeve or shoe. Dress codes were enforced by custom and expectation, and the failure to adhere, even slightly, could result in whispers, exclusion, or reprimand. Perhaps most intriguing, however, was how deeply the rhythms of Versailles ignored the world outside. As harvests failed and bread riots shook Paris, the palace maintained its rituals. As revolutionary thought simmered, the king still rose in public each morning. As change gathered force, the clocks of Versailles ticked on, marking hours not in revolution, but in routine. And when the end came, it was not sudden. Rituals continued even as their purpose faded. The courtyards still echoed with polished footsteps. The chapel still rang with mass. The gardens still bloomed, though fewer walked them. The final illusion of Versailles was not its wealth or its power, but its constancy. That within its walls time could be mastered, that change could be held at bay. But time, as always, moved forward. And when the revolution came, it didn't shatter the rituals. It simply ignored them. The lever ended. The coucher ceased. The gilded clocks ticked into silence. As we leave behind the ovens, salons, kitchens, and corridors of 18th century France, we do not emerge from a world of spectacle, but from one of structure. These stories were not of revolutions or proclamations, but of repetition. The turning of dough in the early hours, the measured step of a servant down a polished hallway, the weighing of a loaf, the tightening of a corset, the lifting of a curtain. Each small act, invisible on its own, became part of the architecture of a world that was deeply human, yet rarely remembered. We began with the bakers, figures draped not in lace or metals, but in ash and sweat. Their work done in darkness fed a city that barely noticed them. Then came Charlotte Corday, whose name history preserved, though her quiet beginnings and uncertain legacy have been smoothed over by myth. In the kitchens of Rococo aristocrats, we saw not feasts, but symbols, ingredients wielded like emblems of power, and meals arranged not to nourish, but to perform. Finally, we walked through the gilded hush of Versailles, where even time bowed to ceremony until it no longer could. And throughout it all, a single rhythm endured. Life lived not in extraordinary moments, but in repeated ones. These are not the stories that rouse armies or inspire thunderous applause. They are the ones that slip between the pages, the ones passed over by textbooks and grand tours. But they mattered. They built the scaffold of daily life. They whispered of pressures, habits, fears and desires too quiet for proclamation, yet too persistent to erase. As you settle now, whether into sleep or simply stillness, perhaps there is comfort in knowing that history too had its routines, that behind every explosion of change there were years of repetition. Behind every famous name, thousands more whose names were never written down, and that even in the most elaborate palace or the humblest bakehouse, people woke, worked, waited, worried, and wondered, just like now. Until next time, when we will once again unfold the past, not with fanfare, but with the gentle, steady rhythm of a world once lived.